The night was cool, with a crispness in the air that hinted at the coming fall. Seattle's ever-present drizzle tapped lightly against the windows of Emma Porter's apartment, a rhythmic sound that usually lulled her to sleep. But tonight, sleep felt like a distant, elusive thing. Emma stared at the ceiling, her mind buzzing with the day's events. She had spent the last few weeks covering a particularly grueling story, a series of disappearances in the city that had left the community on edge. As a journalist, Emma had a knack for getting to the heart of a story, for uncovering the truth buried beneath layers of fear and misinformation. But this one was different. It gnawed at her, kept her awake at night, making her question things she once considered certain. Finally, exhaustion overtook her, and Emma drifted into a restless sleep. But instead of the usual dreams of wandering through a familiar cityscape or the occasional odd adventure, she found herself somewhere else entirely. It was dark. Inky blackness surrounded her, pressing in on all sides. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were encased in thick mud. Panic began to rise in her chest as she realized she was trapped in a small, suffocating space with no way out. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew thin, making it hard to breathe. Emma opened her mouth to scream, to cry out for help, but no sound emerged. Her voice was gone, stolen by the darkness that surrounded her. The silence was deafening, a heavy, oppressive quiet that made her heart pound in her chest. The more she struggled, the tighter the space seemed to become, as if it were alive, responding to her fear. Just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, she jolted awake, gasping for air. The cool air of her apartment was a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the dream, but the fear lingered, clinging to her like a second skin. Her heart raced and she wiped sweat from her brow, trying to shake the remnants of the nightmare. For a moment, Emma sat in bed, trying to convince herself it was just a dream, but it felt too real, too visceral to be dismissed so easily. She could still feel the weight of the darkness, the pressure of the walls, the terror of being voiceless. The memory of it lingered as she got up, the hardwood floor cold under her bare feet. She shuffled into the bathroom, flicking on the light. The harsh fluorescent glare made her wince, but she needed the brightness, the reassurance of reality. Splashing cold water on her face, she stared at her reflection, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Her pale blue eyes were wide with fear, the pupils dilated, and her skin had a pallor that she didn't recognize. It was just a dream, she told herself again. Nothing more. But as she looked closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A faint bruise had formed on her left wrist, the kind that might appear if someone had grabbed her too tightly. She hadn't fallen, hadn't hit anything. So where had it come from? A shiver ran down her spine as she touched the bruise, a cold dread settling in her stomach. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought that crept into her mind. It was impossible. A bruise couldn't just appear from a dream. It wasn't logical, wasn't something that made sense. But as she climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, the fear wouldn't leave. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it finally did, it was shallow, plagued by half-formed nightmares and the ever-present sense of being watched. The next morning, Emma pushed the memory of the dream to the back of her mind, determined to focus on her work. But throughout the day, the feeling of unease lingered. The bruise on her wrist throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. As she sat at her desk, typing up her latest article, her thoughts kept drifting back to the dream. It felt like more than just a bad night, more than just a product of stress. The sense of being trapped, of being voiceless, haunted her. And though she tried to ignore it, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that the dream was a warning, a premonition of something dark and terrible looming on the horizon. But Emma was a rational person, and she refused to let a nightmare get the best of her. She buried herself in her work, chasing leads and digging into the details of her latest story. By the time she got home that night, she was exhausted, her eyes heavy with sleep. But as she climbed into bed, the memory of the dream crept back in, bringing with it a sense of dread that she couldn't explain. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing herself to fall asleep to put the nightmare behind her. But when sleep finally came, it was not the peaceful rest she craved. Instead, the darkness returned, wrapping around her like a shroud. The small space, the suffocating air, the voiceless scream. It all came rushing back, more vivid and terrifying than before. And when she woke up, gasping for breath, her body was marked by new bruises and scratches that had no logical explanation. Emma Porter was not one for superstition, but as the days turned into weeks and the nightmares grew more intense, she began to question the boundaries between dream and reality. The lines blurred, and with each passing night, the darkness seemed to close in a little more, bringing with it a terror that she could not escape. The unsettling dreams had taken root, and they were only just beginning. The days after the nightmares began were a blur for Emma. She moved through them like a ghost, going through the motions of her daily routine, while a growing sense of dread gnawed at her insides. The bruises and scratches that appeared on her body each morning were becoming harder to dismiss. She had tried to convince herself they were the result of some unconscious thrashing in her sleep, but deep down, she knew better. Emma's work, once a source of pride and solace, became a burden. The story of the missing persons, which she had been so eager to crack, now felt like a distant memory. Her focus had shifted entirely to the strange occurrences that were consuming her life. She began to withdraw from her colleagues, avoiding their concerned glances and questions. How could she explain the unexplainable? The logical part of her mind screamed for answers, but none came. As the nightmares continued, Emma noticed something even more disturbing. Her fear was no longer confined to the night. It had started creeping into her waking hours, manifesting as sudden waves of anxiety that would hit her out of nowhere, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She would be sitting at her desk, trying to concentrate on her work, when a cold chill would wash over her, making her skin prickle and her heart race. At first, these moments were brief, passing in seconds, but they grew longer and more intense with each passing day. Then came the paralysis. It was a Tuesday evening, and Emma was feeling more exhausted than usual. The day had been long, filled with the monotony of tasks that should have been simple but now felt insurmountable. Her mind was in a fog, and her body felt heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force. After forcing down a few bites of dinner, she decided to turn in early, hoping for a few hours of peaceful sleep, a luxury she hadn't enjoyed in weeks. As she lay in bed, the familiar sense of dread began to settle over her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that it was just her overactive imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. The darkness of her bedroom seemed to press in on her, suffocating and oppressive. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to fall asleep, to escape the waking nightmare her life had become. But sleep brought no escape. In the early hours of the morning, Emma awoke with a start. Her eyes flew open, but she couldn't move. She was lying on her back, staring up at the ceiling, her body completely frozen. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't even blink, let alone cry out for help. Every muscle in her body was locked in place, as if she had been bound by invisible chains. Her breathing was shallow, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might burst from her chest. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. Emma's mind screamed in terror, but her body refused to obey. The figure was tall and indistinct, more a presence than a physical form. It was shrouded in darkness with no discernible features except for its eyes, two pinpoints of glowing light that burned into her, filling her with a dread so deep it felt like her very soul was being pulled from her body. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. The longer it stared, the more Emma felt herself slipping away, as if her very essence was being drained by the intensity of its gaze. The room seemed to grow colder, the air around her thickening, making it even harder to breathe. She wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to break free from the invisible bonds holding her down, but she was completely powerless. It felt like an eternity before the paralysis released its grip on her. When it did, it was as sudden as it had come. Emma bolted upright, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her hands flew to her face, then to her throat, desperate to feel something solid, something real. But the terror remained, a cold knot in her stomach that refused to unravel. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the room, a shadow that refused to fade. Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign that what she had just experienced was real. But there was nothing. No trace of the figure, no sound, nothing except the echo of her own ragged breathing. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Sleep paralysis. That had to be it. She had read about it before, how people sometimes woke up unable to move, caught between sleep and wakefulness, their minds conjuring terrifying hallucinations. It was a rational explanation, one that she clung to desperately. But the bruises on her wrists and ankles told a different story, one that she couldn't ignore. Sleep paralysis didn't leave physical marks. Over the next few days, the paralysis episodes became more frequent, striking without warning. They didn't always come at night. Sometimes she would be sitting on the couch or working at her desk when it would hit her, freezing her in place, the figure's shadowy form always lurking just at the edge of her vision. Each time, the terror was more intense, the figure drawing closer, its glowing eyes burning into her. Emma was unraveling. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the growing sense of helplessness. It was all too much. She began avoiding sleep altogether, staying up as late as she could, hoping to avoid the paralysis and the figure that haunted her. But exhaustion always won in the end, dragging her back into the nightmare. She was living in a waking hell, her days consumed by the fear of what awaited her in the night. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and she found herself questioning her own sanity. How could this be happening? What was the figure, and why was it tormenting her? No matter how hard she tried to find answers, they eluded her. The figure remained a dark, silent presence, watching, waiting. Emma knew it was only a matter of time before it made its move, and the thought filled her with a terror that went beyond anything she had ever known. The paralysis had taken hold of her life, and there was no escape. The descent into darkness was not sudden for Emma. It was a slow, agonizing spiral that she barely noticed until it was too late. The nightmares, the paralysis, The figure with the glowing eyes. These had become a regular part of her life, haunting every moment, both waking and asleep. But as the days turned into weeks, something more insidious began to take hold. The darkness that had once been confined to the night was now creeping into the daylight, seeping into every corner of her existence. It started with the lights. Emma's apartment, once a cozy refuge, now felt like a prison. The warm, inviting glow of her lamps and overhead lights began to flicker, their brightness dimming at the most inconvenient moments. It wasn't a power issue. She had checked. The bulbs were fine, the wiring intact. But the lights flickered nonetheless, leaving her in darkness just long enough for the shadows to grow, for the fear to creep in. During the day, she would notice it too. An unnatural dimness in rooms that should have been bright with sunlight. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, linger longer, as if they were alive, waiting for their chance to consume her. The darkness was no longer content with the night. It wanted her all the time. Emma's work suffered. The once passionate journalist found herself unable to focus, her mind constantly drifting back to the nightmares, the figure, the creeping darkness. She missed deadlines, botched interviews, and eventually stopped showing up at the office altogether. Her editor, a gruff but well-meaning man named Robert, called her repeatedly, his concern evident in his voice. But Emma couldn't bring herself to answer. What could she say? That she was being hunted by a shadowy figure that only appeared when she was at her most vulnerable? It sounded insane, even to her. So she withdrew further, isolating herself from the world, cutting off contact with friends and family. The only person she hadn't completely pushed away was Sarah, her best friend since college. But even Sarah had begun to grow distant, her concern turning into frustration as Emma refused to let her in. One night, after yet another terrifying episode of paralysis, Sarah showed up at Emma's apartment unannounced. She was furious, rightfully so, but her anger quickly turned to horror when she saw the state of her friend. Emma was a shadow of her former self, her once bright eyes dull and lifeless, her skin pale and drawn. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of endless sleepless nights, and the bruises and scratches that marred her skin were impossible to ignore. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "You look like you're dying. You have to let me help you." Emma wanted to tell her, wanted to pour out everything she had been experiencing, but the words stuck in her throat. She was terrified that the figure would somehow know, that it would punish her for revealing its presence. So she said nothing, just shook her head and pulled away from Sarah's touch. "You can't keep doing this," Sarah pleaded, her voice softer now, full of concern. "Whatever it is, you're not alone. We can figure this out together." But Emma knew better. The figure wasn't something that could be defeated by talking about it, by sharing the burden. It was something ancient, something evil, and it had its claws deep into her. If she involved Sarah, it would only put her in danger too. The figure had already taken so much from her, she couldn't bear the thought of it taking her best friend as well. "Please, just go," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want you to get hurt." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between her fear for Emma and her desire to help. But in the end, she relented, realizing that she couldn't force Emma to open up. With a final worried glance, she left, leaving Emma alone in the growing darkness. It wasn't long after that night that the figure began to escalate its attacks. The paralysis came more frequently, sometimes several times in a single night. Each time, the figure was closer, more solid, more real. Emma could feel its presence now, could smell the acrid stench of decay that clung to it. And the worst part was, she could feel it touching her. Cold, bony fingers brushing against her skin, leaving behind bruises and scratches that burned long after the paralysis ended. Emma's fear turned to desperation. She began to scour the internet for answers, for anything that might explain what was happening to her. She spent hours reading about sleep paralysis, about shadow people, about demons and spirits that fed on fear. But nothing she found offered any real solution, only vague warnings and cryptic advice that did little to comfort her. She started to avoid sleep as much as possible, staying up late into the night, her eyes gritty with exhaustion. But no matter how hard she tried, sleep would eventually claim her, dragging her back into the nightmare. And each time she woke, she felt weaker, as if the figure was slowly draining the life out of her. The darkness in her apartment grew thicker, more oppressive. Even during the day, the shadows seemed to follow her, clinging to her like a second skin. She could feel it watching her, could feel its hunger growing. It wanted her fear, her life, her very soul. And Emma knew that she couldn't fight it forever. The final straw came one evening when Emma was trying to force herself to eat something, anything, to keep her strength up. She was sitting at her kitchen table, staring blankly at a bowl of soup, when the lights began to flicker again. But this time they didn't stop. The flickering grew more intense, the bulbs buzzing angrily as they dimmed and brightened, over and over again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, frozen in fear. And then, with a loud pop, the lights went out completely, plunging the apartment into total darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the sound of Emma's ragged breathing. She knew what was coming, but she was powerless to stop it. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, and then she felt it, the cold, bony fingers wrapping around her throat. The figure was there, standing over her, its glowing eyes burning into her soul. Emma tried to scream, to fight, but the paralysis had taken hold of her again. She was trapped, helpless as the figure's grip tightened, cutting off her air. The world began to blur around her, her vision dimming as she struggled for breath. But just as she felt herself slipping away, the figure released her. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling violently. She lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too exhausted to care. When she finally managed to get up, the darkness had receded, the lights flickering back on as if nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. The figure had shown its true power, had demonstrated just how easily it could take her life if it wanted to. And now, more than ever, she was certain that it was only a matter of time before it did. The descent into darkness was complete. Emma was no longer living. She was merely surviving, a shell of her former self. The figure had taken everything from her, her career, her friends, her sense of safety. And now it was coming for the last thing she had left, her soul. As she lay in bed that night, waiting for the next attack, Emma felt a cold resolve settle over her. She couldn't outrun the darkness, couldn't escape the figure, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to fight it. It was a slim hope, a desperate gamble, but it was all she had left. And so, as the shadows closed in around her once again, Emma prepared herself for the final battle. She didn't know if she could win, but she knew one thing for certain. She would not go quietly into the darkness. The night was still, unnervingly so, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Emma Porter sat in the center of her darkened apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her once normal life. The photographs on the wall, the books on the shelves, the trinkets she had collected over the years, all of it felt foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else. Someone who had lived a life full of promise and hope, a life that had been systematically stripped away, piece by piece, by the darkness that now suffused every corner of her existence. Emma's body was a battlefield, the marks of her struggle etched into her skin, bruises, scratches, the faint outlines of handprints that had no earthly origin. She had stopped trying to explain them, stopped trying to rationalize the horror that had taken hold of her life. It was beyond reason, beyond anything she had ever known or could have imagined. And now, as she sat in the silence, she knew that the end was near. The figure had grown bolder, its presence no longer confined to the night or the moments of paralysis. It was with her always, a shadowy specter that lingered at the edge of her vision, just out of reach. She could feel it watching her, its glowing eyes boring into her soul, consuming her fear, her despair, feeding on the darkness that had taken root inside her. Every breath she took felt like borrowed time, a fleeting moment before the inevitable. She had tried to fight it, tried to find a way out of the nightmare that had become her life, but every attempt had been in vain. The figure was too powerful, too ancient, its grip on her too strong. It had taken everything from her, her job, her friends, her very sense of self. All that was left was the cold, suffocating fear that wrapped around her like a shroud. But Emma was not yet ready to give up, not completely. There was a part of her, buried deep beneath the layers of terror and despair, that refused to surrender. It was a small, flickering ember of defiance, a remnant of the strong, determined woman she had once been. And it was that ember that drove her to make her final stand. Tonight would be the night. Emma could feel it in her bones, in the way the air seemed to vibrate with tension, in the way the darkness seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The figure was coming for her, and she would either defeat it or be consumed by it. The hours passed slowly, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound that broke the silence. Emma sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the doorway to her bedroom, waiting for the figure to appear. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her mind focused. She had no plan, no weapon to wield against the figure, but she had her will, her determination to survive, to not let the darkness win. And then, just before midnight, it came. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unnatural chill that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. The shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into a single formless mass that began to take shape. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, her body frozen with fear and anticipation. The figure emerged from the darkness, tall and imposing, its eyes glowing with that terrible, otherworldly light. It was more solid now, more real, as if it had drawn strength from the weeks of torment it had inflicted upon her. Its presence filled the room, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but she was rooted to the spot, unable to move as the figure approached. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a wave of cold wash over her, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. The figure's hand reached out, skeletal and cold, brushing against her cheek with a touch that burned like ice. But this time something was different. This time, Emma didn't flinch. The fear was still there, gnawing at her, but it was joined by something else. Anger. A deep, primal rage that had been building inside her for weeks, ever since the nightmares had begun. The figure had taken everything from her, had reduced her to a shell of her former self, and now it was here to finish the job. But Emma would not go quietly. With a surge of defiance, she broke free from the paralysis that had held her captive for so long. Her hands flew to the figure's outstretched arm, her fingers digging into the cold, shadowy substance that passed for its flesh. The figure recoiled slightly, as if surprised by her resistance, but Emma didn't let go. She held on with everything she had, her anger fueling her, giving her strength. "You won't take me," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. "Not without a fight." The figure's eyes flared, its grip tightening on her, but Emma refused to back down. She could feel the darkness closing in, could feel her strength waning, but she held on, fighting with every ounce of willpower she had left. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, feel the cold sweat on her skin, but she didn't let go. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the two of them locked in a battle of wills. The figure loomed over her, its form shifting and twisting as it struggled to maintain its grip. Emma could feel it weakening, could feel the power shifting ever so slightly in her favor. But she knew she couldn't hold on forever. Her strength was fading, her body trembling with the effort of resisting the overwhelming force of the darkness. And then, with a final, desperate surge of energy, Emma let out a scream that had been building inside her for weeks, a scream that carried all the fear, the pain, the anger she had felt since the nightmares had begun. It was a scream of defiance, a scream of rage, a scream that tore through the silence of the night like a thunderclap. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as if it had been struck by a physical blow. The room seemed to vibrate with the force of Emma's scream, the shadows retreating, the darkness receding. For a moment, Emma thought she had won, thought that she had driven the figure back into whatever hell it had come from. But then, just as quickly as it had recoiled, the figure surged forward, its eyes blazing with a terrible light. It reached out, its hands closing around Emma's throat, and this time, there was no escape. The darkness flooded back, engulfing her, swallowing her whole. Emma's scream was cut off, the sound dying in her throat as the figure dragged her down into the blackness. The world around her dissolved into shadow, the cold pressing in on her from all sides. Emma felt herself slipping away, felt the last remnants of her strength being drained by the darkness. But even as the figure pulled her into the void, she refused to give in. She clung to the last shred of her defiance, holding on to it like a lifeline. But the darkness was relentless. It consumed her, body and soul, until there was nothing left but silence. The figure's glowing eyes were the last thing she saw before everything went black, before the darkness claimed her completely. And then, there was nothing. The authorities found Emma's body the next morning, lying cold and lifeless on the floor of her apartment. The cause of death was undetermined, her expression frozen in a mask of terror. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, nothing to explain the look of absolute horror on her face. The apartment was silent, undisturbed, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But for those who knew Emma, who had seen the fear in her eyes in the weeks leading up to her death, the truth was clear. The darkness had won. It had taken her just as it had taken so many others before her, leaving behind only an empty shell and the memory of a silent scream. As the world outside moved on, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded within those four walls, the shadows in Emma's apartment seemed to stretch a little longer, linger a little darker. And somewhere in the depths of that darkness, the figure waited, its hunger not yet sated, its glowing eyes watching, always watching, for the next soul to claim. The silence was complete, but if one listened closely, they might have heard it. The faint echo of a scream, carried on the wind, lost in the shadows, a final cry for help that would never be answered.